President Trump's sweeping tariff hike on imports from India officially took effect today, with goods from the country now facing a 50% levy, one of the highest in the president's tariff toolkit. India have yet to reach a bilateral trade deal despite holding 5 rounds of negotiations.
President Trump's trade war, because today it has a new target. As of nearly 2 hours ago now, midnight in Washington, 9:30 a.m. in Delhi, most Indian goods imported into the US face a 50% tariff. The US imposed a 25% import tax earlier this month because of what the administration sees.
President Trump's trade war has taken a dramatic turn, with India now squarely in the crosshairs. As of midnight in Washington on August 27, 2025, which was 9:30 a.m. in Delhi, a significant portion of Indian goods entering the United States began facing a 50% tariff. This escalation builds on a 25% import tax imposed earlier in the month, driven by the administration's concerns over India's economic ties with Russia. The move has officially doubled the tariffs on Indian products, marking one of the highest rates in the president's arsenal of trade tools. Despite 5 rounds of negotiations, the two nations have failed to secure a bilateral trade deal, leaving tensions at a boiling point. Everyday routines in America, from grabbing a morning coffee to picking up prescriptions at the pharmacy or indulging in the latest gadget over the weekend, are feeling the strain. These simple habits are costing more, turning what were once affordable necessities into burdensome expenses. A cup of coffee digs deeper into your pocket, essential medications start to feel like extravagances, and that new device you have been eyeing seems increasingly unattainable. This is not a random occurrence, it is the direct fallout from a policy decision that has rippled through global supply chains, from distant ports to the shelves of your neighborhood store. Indian officials have emphasized that these tariffs will not hurt their economy as much as they will burden American consumers. What started as a strategic strike against perceived foreign adversaries is now clashing with the budgets of millions of households across the United States. If one executive order can disrupt so much, what further changes might lie ahead, and how profound could the repercussions become? On August 6, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that added another 25% tariff on a broad array of Indian imports, compounding the initial 25% increase from August 1st. This brought the total to a staggering 50%, the most severe rate ever applied to any Asian country. Over half of India's $87 billion in yearly exports to the United States are now subject to this barrier, potentially disrupting established trade patterns that support livelihoods on both sides. The White House positioned this as a national security imperative, highlighting India's increased buying of discounted Russian oil, which by mid-2025 accounted for more than 1/3 of its energy imports, totaling around $31 billion annually. In a public statement, Trump made his stance clear. India is funding Putin's war efforts, and if they continue to challenge America, they will face consequences. This links India's energy strategy directly to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. However, this was not an impulsive action. Frustrations between Washington and New Delhi have simmered for years. The United States maintains a $44 billion goods trade deficit with India, exacerbated by India's protective tariffs on sectors like agriculture and dairy. Additionally, India's involvement in the BRICS group, which now represents nearly half of global GDP, raises concerns, particularly as the bloc explores gold-backed currencies and alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. For the Trump administration, India's actions crossed a critical threshold. Despite India's efforts to mitigate tensions by boosting purchases of U.S. defense gear and energy, increasing imports by 70% to $6.6 billion in the first half of 2025, it was deemed insufficient. The persistent oil dealings with Moscow were viewed as unacceptable, and after unsuccessful talks, relations deteriorated. Indian leaders countered by accusing the U.S. of double standards, pointing out that Europe and China buy far more Russian energy without similar penalties. The tariffs embody the America First approach at its most aggressive, intended to isolate Russia and extract concessions from India. Yet, experts have cautioned that this is a high-stakes bet that could erode decades of bilateral trust. Former U.S. Ambassador to India Kenneth Juster warned that it jeopardizes joint initiatives like the Quad Alliance, meant to counterbalance China's influence. The tariffs went live on August 27 after a short grace period, encompassing textiles, furniture, gems, chemicals, and more. Pharmaceuticals were initially targeted but granted a temporary exemption, though the overall momentum of disruption was already underway. What was conceived as a precise policy has evolved into a comprehensive trade conflict, with effects spilling beyond diplomatic circles into ordinary lives. Analysts from the Tax Foundation project that these tariffs could impose an additional $200 to $300 in yearly costs on the average middle-class family by year's end. With inflation already pressuring budgets, this influx of pricier imports is amplifying the squeeze, transforming budget-friendly goods into premium-priced items. Take Janelle Grimes, a single mother in Houston working as a pharmacy technician. She depends on Indian-produced generic drugs for her son's asthma and her heart medication. Suddenly, her son's inhaler rose from $45 to $70, compelling her to forego her own prescription. She shared with reporters that Indian generics are lifelines for many families, but now they are slipping out of reach. This anecdote mirrors a larger predicament. The American Hospital Association reports that nearly 40% of U.S. generic drugs, valued at over $10 billion yearly, originate from India. As supplies dwindle, prices have surged by 35%, leading to rationing in hospitals like those in Boston, where patients await critical treatments in desperation. The distress extends to rural areas too. In Iowa, farmer Tom Reynolds saw India cancel soybean and corn orders, redirecting them to Brazil. With 50,000 bushels unsold, he anticipates a $400,000 loss. He confided that prices are plummeting and bankruptcy looms. The U.S. Department of Agriculture confirms $2 billion in export losses, with grain prices dropping 12%, devastating farming communities. In Kansas, this has led to restaurant closures and reduced local commerce, as one mayor noted. When farmers suffer, entire towns falter. Even the tech industry, typically resilient, is reeling. Silicon Valley relies on Indian IT services, which provide over half of global outsourcing. In retaliation, Indian companies hiked rates for U.S. clients by 20%, adding $12 billion in costs according to Gartner. This has delayed product releases, prompted layoffs, and heightened investor unease. A San Francisco executive told CNBC that expenses spiked 30% in one quarter. Financial markets echoed the anxiety, with the Dow Jones dropping 1,200 points on August 7th, and consumer confidence hitting a 15-year low, as two-thirds of Americans felt financially worse off. The overarching narrative is clear. A policy touted as protective has become intimately disruptive for families, agricultural producers, and corporate executives nationwide. What appeared as an international tactic is profoundly altering domestic realities. Meanwhile, India did not hesitate to respond. By early September, projections indicated $37 billion in lost U.S. exports. Prime Minister Narendra Modi leveraged the situation to bolster national unity, stating in Parliament that India will not succumb to external pressures, prioritizing energy security for its 1.4 billion people. To cushion the impact, New Delhi exempted pharmaceuticals from retaliation to prevent mutual damage, but allocated $5 billion in subsidies to vital export sectors. Taxes on essentials were reduced, and India hastened its shift toward BRICS allies, boosting non-dollar trade by 23% in mere weeks. Textile and gem exports were rerouted to Europe and the Gulf, with over 100 jewelers participating in trade fairs. India's alignment with Russia and China intensified, with Modi and Putin showcasing their bond at global forums. The U.S.-India defense partnership took a hit, as India halted major arms acquisitions from Washington, labeling it a betrayal. Back in the U.S., the policy's drawbacks became unavoidable. On August 22nd, the Department of Health and Human Services unveiled $5 billion in incentives to relocate pharmaceutical manufacturing to states like Texas and Michigan. However, specialists note that establishing domestic production might require 5 to 7 years, offering no immediate relief to struggling households. Farmers, facing $2 billion in losses, called for government aid. Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley criticized the administration for abandoning rural America in a perceived political maneuver. Tech executives echoed the sentiment, arguing that rising costs undermine U.S. competitiveness. President Trump suggested a potential dialogue with Modi but also proposed 100% tariffs on India via the European Union, a notion met with no response from Brussels. Political repercussions intensified, with Democrats portraying the tariffs as self-sabotaging, and some Republicans expressing concerns over constituent hardships. Economists offered blunt assessments. Jeffrey Sachs described India's realignment as a sensible step that isolates the U.S. Larry Summers deemed the tariffs disastrous, asserting they harm American buyers most. Others commended India's adaptability, with policy analyst A.J. Srivastav viewing its approach as a model for enduring economic conflicts. By late September, the standoff's toll was evident. The tariffs disrupted $87 billion in trade, revealing U.S. dependencies on India in medicine, technology, and agriculture. Hospitals nationwide persisted in rationing drugs, with physicians alerting that patients would suffer most. Tech leaders acknowledged underestimating India's influence, as companies pivoted to Europe and startups grappled with survival-threatening expenses. Midwestern farmers, key to U.S. exports, were left adrift as India sourced grain from Brazil. Ironically, a policy aimed at safeguarding American employment achieved the reverse. Costs escalated, supply chains broke, and competitors advanced. University of Pennsylvania researchers forecasted a potential 0.8% contraction in U.S. GDP for 2025 if the tariffs persist. From medication scarcities to hindered innovation and idle silos in agricultural regions, the pattern is consistent. A measure intended to demonstrate power has instead revealed vulnerabilities domestically. By summer's close, the United States and India, formerly strategic collaborators, were entrenched in an acrimonious economic impasse. The expenses are immense. American consumers facing $1,300 more annually, farmers forfeiting billions in sales, and tech enterprises buckling under elevated costs. India, despite a $36 billion deficit, reinforced its BRICS affiliations, hastening the emergence of a multipolar global order. Washington's previous surplus in services, from IT to educating Indian students, now teeters. Even U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan conceded it as a strategic setback, diminishing the Quad and eroding confidence. In Surat, India's textile epicenter, the rhythmic hum of looms has faded to quietude, a silence weighted with adversity. For generations, local craftsmen have woven fabrics destined for American markets, adorning stores and events. Now, with tariffs effectively doubling export costs, deliveries halt, factories shutter, and laborers confront unemployment. The impact spans beyond textiles to jewelry, seafood, and spices, core elements of the $87 billion U.S.-India trade link, now squeezed in an economic clamp. Yet, the waves reach American shores too. In Artesia, California, dubbed Little India, the effects manifest vividly. Once, saffron aromas wafted through grocers, and vibrant saris gleamed in displays. Today, proprietors face daunting calculations. For Genial Mehta, a sari shop owner, one shipment's tariff totaled $62,000. To sustain operations, she relinquished her yearly salary and dismissed 2 veteran staff members. Family-run eateries, long-standing community staples, witness imported spices and liquors become prohibitively expensive, rendering traditional dishes unfeasible. One proprietor remarked that navigating the COVID era was simpler than this economic turmoil. This confrontation between Washington and New Delhi is fundamentally a contest for sway in an evolving world order, waged in workshops, harbors, and communities distant from power centers. To delve deeper into the economic ramifications, consider the projections from various analysts. India's chief economic advisor has indicated that the tariffs could reduce the country's GDP growth by 0.5 percentage points, a significant dent for an economy aiming for rapid expansion. Exporter associations estimate that 55% of India's $87 billion in merchandise shipments to the U.S. are affected, potentially benefiting competitors like Vietnam or Bangladesh in sectors such as apparel and footwear. On the U.S. side, the budget lab at Yale highlights that these tariffs disproportionately hit clothing and textiles, with consumers potentially paying 39% more for shoes and 37% more for apparel items. Inflationary pressures are mounting as imported goods become scarcer and dearer, contributing to broader price increases across the economy. The Peterson Institute for International Economics warns that sustained tariffs could slow U.S. GDP growth while elevating inflation, echoing patterns from previous trade disputes. In agriculture, the shift in Indian purchases to Brazil not only hurts U.S. farmers but also depresses global commodity prices, creating a vicious cycle for exporters. The tech sector's vulnerabilities are particularly acute, given that Indian firms handle a substantial portion of U.S. outsourcing needs. A 20% rate increase translates to billions in added expenses, which could stifle innovation and lead to offshoring to other low-cost destinations, ironically undermining the America First goal. India's response has been multifaceted and strategic. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has firmly outlined red lines in trade discussions, insisting that any agreement must respect India's core interests, including energy security and domestic protections. Efforts are ongoing to find common ground, but anti-American sentiment has surged, as evidenced by cultural expressions like Durga Puja festivals depicting Trump as a demon in response to the tariffs. Politically, India is cozying up further to Russia and China, with warnings from observers that this places bilateral relations at a critical juncture. Retaliation options are being weighed carefully. Experts suggest waiting 6 months to evaluate the full scope of U.S. actions before responding, avoiding escalation that could harm both sides. Recent developments underscore the immediate consumer impacts. For instance, U.S. shrimp prices have surged due to tariffs on India, the largest supplier, making it one of the first food items to experience major price hikes from this policy. Financial Times reports highlight how this affects everyday dining and grocery bills, illustrating the tangible effects on American tables. Social media buzz, including posts from financial analysts and news outlets, reflects growing public awareness and concern over these rising costs. Looking ahead, the trajectory remains uncertain. Trump has floated ideas like using tariff revenues for farmer bailouts, setting the stage for potential domestic relief measures. However, such interventions could strain federal budgets further. On the diplomatic front, renewed talks might yield concessions, but the damage to trust could linger, weakening alliances like the Quad and emboldening rivals. Economists like those at the Tax Foundation estimate that overall, Trump's tariff regime could boost federal revenues by $171.3 billion, or 0.56% of GDP, but at the cost of higher taxes on consumers and businesses. In a multipolar world, India's pivot serves as a blueprint for other nations navigating U.S. pressures, accelerating de-dollarization and alternative trade blocs. For the U.S., the lesson is stark. Interdependence means that punitive measures often boomerang, hurting domestic interests as much as foreign ones. As this standoff unfolds, it reshapes not just economies but geopolitical alignments, with long-term implications for global stability. To expand on the pharmaceutical angle, India's role as the pharmacy of the world is pivotal. Supplying affordable generics has kept U.S. healthcare costs in check, but disruptions could lead to shortages in antibiotics, painkillers, and chronic disease treatments. Hospitals are already implementing contingency plans, but the timeline for domestic alternatives is daunting. In agriculture, the soybean saga exemplifies vulnerability. U.S. farmers exported billions worth to India pre-tariffs, and the loss cascades to related industries like transportation and processing. Tech dependencies run deep too. Indian talent powers U.S. innovation through H-1B visas and outsourcing, but strained ties could reduce this flow, impacting Silicon Valley's edge. BRICS dynamics add complexity. With members pushing non-dollar settlements, the tariffs might hasten a shift away from U.S. financial dominance, affecting everything from reserve currencies to investment flows. Personal stories humanize the data. Beyond Janelle and Tom, consider Sarah in Boston, delaying surgery due to drug unavailability, or the Kansas restaurateur closing shop amid falling patronage. In India, Surat's weavers, now idle, represent millions in export-reliant jobs at risk, potentially fueling social unrest. Expert consensus leans critical. Warwick McKibben's models predict slowed U.S. growth and rising inflation. A.J. Srivastav praises India's resilience as pragmatic. Larry Summers calls it catastrophic for consumers. These views underscore a policy miscalculation. Future scenarios: escalation to 100% tariffs risks full rupture. De-escalation via deals could restore balance, but requires compromise on red lines like Russian ties. Bailouts might mitigate farm losses, but add debt. Monitoring shrimp-like indicators will reveal ongoing effects. In conclusion, this trade war, rooted in security and deficit concerns, has unleashed widespread economic pain, highlighting globalization's double-edged sword. As voices call for resolution, the path forward demands nuanced diplomacy to rebuild ties and minimize harm. The story continues, with each development shaping tomorrow's world order. To ensure a comprehensive understanding, let us examine historical parallels. Trump's first term saw tariffs on China, leading to similar consumer price hikes and supply shifts. Lessons unlearned? Perhaps, but India's unique position as ally-turned-target adds novelty. BRICS expansion, now including more nations, amplifies leverage against U.S. measures. Sector deep dives. Textiles face 50% hits, potentially adding 37% to U.S. clothing costs per Yale estimates. Gems and jewelry, vital for Indian employment, seek Gulf markets. Seafood, like shrimp, sees immediate surges, affecting restaurants and fisheries. India's subsidies and tax cuts aim to boost competitiveness, while non-dollar trade with BRICS reduces vulnerability. U.S. incentives for onshoring pharma signal long-term strategy, but execution lags. Public sentiment, per X posts, shows frustration over food prices, with analysts tracking Trumpnomics impacts. Geopolitical podcasts discuss red lines and alliances. Ultimately, this episode tests resilience, with outcomes defining economic trajectories for years.